Egotistical marries a lowly housekeeper. What happens next changes his life forever. Adrian Blackwell leaned back in his sleek, ergonomic office chair, surveying the towering windows of his penthouse office. The city skyline sprawled before him, a glistening monument to his accomplishments. He exhaled slowly, the tension from a day of ruthless deal-making dissipating with the view. Adrian wasn't just successful, he was untouchable. At 38, he controlled one of the most influential real estate empires in the country, and he liked to think of himself as the architect of his own destiny. Yet, the satisfaction he usually felt was curiously absent tonight. A comment from an associate at a recent board meeting gnawed at the back of his mind. "Adrian, you've got everything, but when's the last time you did something real? Something human?" The room had erupted in laughter, but Adrian couldn't let it go. The implication that he lacked authenticity felt like an insult wrapped in jest. As he sipped his scotch, his gaze landed on the cleaning crew bustling quietly around the office. Their uniforms were crisp, their movements precise. Among them was Emma, a petite woman in her late 20s, her dark hair tied neatly in a bun. She had worked in his penthouse suite for months, but Adrian had never paid her much attention. She was, after all, part of the background, a silent figure in his meticulously curated world. But tonight, something about her caught his eye. She moved with an understated grace, her focus unwavering as she wiped down the polished surfaces. She was different from the people Adrian surrounded himself with, different from the associates who laughed at his jokes or the women who attended events on his arm. Emma seemed unbothered by the opulence around her. He set his glass down, a spark of an idea igniting in his mind. What better way to silence his critics, to prove that Adrian Blackwell could connect with the real world? He could already see the headlines: "Billionaire marries working-class woman." It would be a performance, of course, but one that would reinforce his image as a man capable of anything. The following evening, Adrian called Emma into his office. She entered cautiously, clutching her cleaning supplies. Her uniform was pristine, but her expression was wary, as though she couldn't quite believe he had summoned her. "Miss," Adrian paused, realizing he didn't know her last name. "Emma Carter," she supplied, her voice steady despite her apparent nervousness. "Miss Carter," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. She hesitated before sitting, her posture rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Adrian studied her for a moment, intrigued by her composure. "How long have you worked here?" "6 months," she replied, her eyes meeting his briefly before darting away. "I've been with the cleaning agency for over 3 years." He nodded, leaning forward. "And what's your impression of this place? Be honest." Emma blinked, clearly caught off guard. "It's beautiful," she said carefully. "Very different from where I live." Adrian smirked. "I imagine it is. And where do you live, Miss Carter?" She hesitated. "In Brooklyn. A small apartment. I share it with my sister." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Modest circumstances, then. Tell me, Emma, do you enjoy working here?" She hesitated again, her brows furrowing slightly. "It's a job. It pays the bills." Her answer lacked the deference he was accustomed to, and it intrigued him further. He decided to get to the point. "I have a proposition for you. One that could change your circumstances entirely." Emma's expression tightened. "What kind of proposition?" Adrian's smile was calculated. "I want you to marry me." For a moment, the room was silent. Emma stared at him, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though trying to determine if this was some kind of elaborate joke. "Marry you?" she repeated, her voice incredulous. "Yes," Adrian said smoothly. "It would be a mutually beneficial arrangement. You'll receive financial stability and security, and let's just say it will help with my public image." Emma stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're joking?" "I assure you, I'm not," Adrian said, his tone unflappable. "This is a business arrangement, Miss Carter. Nothing more." She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You think you can just buy a wife?" Adrian's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone in Emma's position. "I'm offering you an opportunity. A chance to improve your life." Emma met his gaze, her eyes flashing with indignation. "My life may not be luxurious, Mr. Blackwell, but it's mine. I won't sell myself just to be part of your PR stunt." Her words stung more than he cared to admit. Adrian stood, his demeanor turning colder. "Think carefully, Miss Carter. This isn't just about you. Your sister could benefit as well, better living conditions, financial support for her education. Do you really want to walk away from that?" Emma's defiance faltered, and Adrian knew he had struck a nerve. She looked down, her fists clenched at her sides. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice quieter but still firm. "I need time to think about it." "Take all the time you need," Adrian said, though his tone made it clear he expected her answer to align with his plan. As Emma left the office, Adrian felt a flicker of uncertainty. She was unlike anyone he had ever dealt with, unimpressed by his wealth, unafraid to stand up to him. It was both infuriating and fascinating. In her tiny Brooklyn apartment that night, Emma sat with her sister, Lucy, who was poring over textbooks at the kitchen table. The cramped space was a stark contrast to the grandeur of Adrian's penthouse, but it was home. Emma replayed his words in her mind, torn between indignation and practicality. Adrian's proposal was insulting on many levels, but the promise of security for Lucy was hard to ignore. She had worked tirelessly to provide for her sister, sacrificing her own dreams along the way. Could she really afford to turn down an opportunity that could change both their lives? Lucy glanced up from her books, sensing Emma's turmoil. "Are you okay?" Emma forced a smile. "Just tired." But as she lay awake that night, staring at the cracked ceiling above her bed, Emma knew that tired wasn't the right word. She was conflicted, unsure of whether to fight for her principles or embrace the chance to give her sister a better future. The following day, Emma returned to Adrian's office, her decision weighing heavily on her shoulders. She had spent the night wrestling with her emotions, but in the end she couldn't ignore what his proposal could mean for Lucy. The prospect of financial security, a better home, and a future free of worry was too compelling to dismiss. Adrian was seated at his desk when she arrived, his attention focused on a tablet displaying financial reports. He glanced up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Miss Carter," he said, setting the tablet aside. "Have you made your decision?" Emma stood tall, determined to meet his gaze without wavering. "I'll do it. But I have conditions." Adrian raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her boldness. "Conditions?" "Yes," Emma said firmly. "If I agree to this arrangement, I need to know that my sister will be taken care of. I want her education fully paid for, and I want assurance that she'll have a safe place to live while I'm involved in this." Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her intently. He appreciated her resolve. It was a rare quality in the people he encountered. "Done," he said after a moment. "Anything else?" Emma hesitated, then added, "And this has to end after 6 months. No extensions. No complications." 6 months, Adrian repeated, nodding. "Agreed." Emma exhaled slowly, relief mingled with unease. She had just made a deal with one of the most calculating men in the city, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a storm she didn't fully understand. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Adrian's PR team went to work crafting the narrative of their whirlwind romance, while Emma was thrust into a world she had never imagined. Designer fittings, etiquette lessons, and carefully choreographed public appearances became her new reality. She felt like an actress in a play, performing a role that wasn't hers. Adrian, meanwhile, observed her transformation with a mix of satisfaction and curiosity. She adapted quickly, surprising him with her ability to hold her own in high society circles. At a charity gala, she navigated conversations with dignitaries and investors with an ease that belied her humble background. Adrian couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride, though he reminded himself that this was all part of the plan. But behind the polished exterior, tension simmered. Emma's quiet defiance hadn't disappeared, it had merely taken on a subtler form. During a dinner party with Adrian's business associates, she challenged him in a way no one else dared. One of the guests, an older man with a sharp tongue, had made a condescending remark about people who don't contribute to society. Adrian had smirked, ready to move on, but Emma had spoken up. Contributions come in many forms, she said, her voice calm but firm. Not everyone has the privilege of wealth, but that doesn't mean their efforts are any less valuable. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Adrian's initial reaction was annoyance. This was supposed to be a carefully controlled environment, and Emma had disrupted it. But as he looked at her, he saw something else: conviction. She wasn't playing a role in that moment. She was speaking her truth. Later that evening, as the guests departed, Adrian confronted her in their suite. "What was that about?" he demanded, his tone clipped. Emma met his gaze without flinching. "I spoke my mind. Isn't that what you wanted, a real person to balance out your image?" Adrian clenched his jaw, unwilling to admit that she had a point. "You don't understand how these people think. You can't just—" "I understand more than you give me credit for," she interrupted. "And if you want me to be part of this, you'll have to accept that I won't stay silent when I see something wrong." Adrian stared at her, his frustration tempered by a grudging respect. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, unyielding, principled, and utterly unapologetic. It was maddening, and yet he couldn't look away. As the months passed, their relationship grew more complicated. Publicly, they played the part of a perfect couple, but privately, their interactions were charged with tension and unspoken truths. Adrian found himself drawn to Emma in ways he hadn't anticipated. She challenged him, forced him to confront parts of himself he had long buried. One evening, as they sat in the penthouse living room, Adrian broke the silence. "Why did you really agree to this?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. Emma hesitated, then said, "Because of Lucy. She deserves a better life than the one we've had." Adrian nodded, sensing there was more to her answer but deciding not to press. He couldn't deny that her selflessness impressed him, even if it made him question his own motivations. But as the end of their 6-month arrangement approached, Adrian began to realize that he didn't want it to end. Emma had become more than a means to an end. She had become a part of his life in ways he hadn't expected. And for the first time, he found himself wondering if he could change, not for appearances, but for her. Adrian sat in his office, staring out at the city skyline. The lights of the towering buildings usually filled him with a sense of accomplishment, a tangible reminder of his success. But tonight, they felt distant, as though they belonged to a world he no longer recognized. The arrangement with Emma was nearing its end, and he couldn't shake the growing knot in his chest. He had built his life on control of his business, his image, and the people around him. But Emma had disrupted that. She hadn't just entered his world, she had reshaped it. Her quiet resilience, her unshakable sense of right and wrong, and the way she could look at him without a hint of fear or reverence, it all unnerved and fascinated him. Adrian's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He turned to see Emma standing there, her expression guarded. She had changed in the months since they'd struck their deal. The uncertainty and unease that once marked her demeanor had given way to confidence, even defiance. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. He gestured for her to come in. "Of course." She entered, her steps deliberate. "I wanted to talk about the arrangement." Adrian leaned back in his chair, his heart sinking. He knew this conversation was coming, but he wasn't ready for it. "What about it?" "It's almost over," she said simply, taking a seat across from him. "I just wanted to confirm that everything we agreed on will be finalized." He studied her, searching for any hint of hesitation or second thoughts. "Of course. You'll get everything we discussed, your sister's education, the financial support. I always keep my word." Emma nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with all the things neither of them dared to say. Finally, Adrian broke it. "Emma, has this all been worth it for you?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. She looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "It's been complicated," she admitted. "But yes, Lucy will have a future, and that's what matters." "And you?" he pressed. "What about your future?" She hesitated, then said, "I'll figure it out. I always do." Her words stung more than he expected. He wanted to argue, to tell her that she didn't have to figure it out alone, but the words caught in his throat. Adrian Blackwell didn't plead or beg. He made decisions and people followed them. But Emma wasn't like anyone else. As she stood to leave, Adrian spoke again. "Do you ever think about what this could have been? If it wasn't just an arrangement?" Emma paused, her hand on the doorframe. She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But that doesn't change what it is." Her honesty hit him like a punch to the gut. She had a way of cutting through the noise, of forcing him to confront truths he preferred to ignore. And the truth was, he didn't want her to leave. After she left, Adrian sat in silence, the weight of his feelings pressing down on him. He had spent his life avoiding attachments, convinced they were a liability. But Emma had shown him that real strength came from connection, from letting someone see the parts of you that you kept hidden. And for the first time, Adrian realized he didn't want to be the man he had been before. The gala marking the anniversary of Adrian's company was a grand affair, held in the largest ballroom in the city. Emma, as always, was by his side, her presence commanding attention. She wore a simple but elegant gown, her confidence radiating in every step. Adrian couldn't take his eyes off her. Throughout the evening, they mingled with guests, playing their roles to perfection. But beneath the surface, Adrian was a storm of emotions. He couldn't focus on the conversations or the accolades being thrown his way. All he could think about was Emma, and how this might be the last time they shared a moment like this. As the evening drew to a close, Adrian pulled Emma aside to the balcony overlooking the city. The air was crisp, carrying the faint hum of traffic below. He turned to her, his heart pounding. "Emma," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I need to say something." She looked at him, her expression wary. "What is it?" He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "This arrangement, it's been more than I ever expected." "You've been more than I ever expected." Emma's brow furrowed. "Adrian." "Let me finish," he interrupted, his voice firm. "When I proposed this deal, I didn't think beyond the surface. I thought it would be simple. But you've changed me, Emma. You've made me see things differently. You've made me want to be better." She stared at him, her eyes searching his. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want this to end," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Not like this. Not with you walking away and me going back to the man I was before." Emma's breath caught, her composure faltering for the first time. She looked away, her thoughts racing. "Adrian, this wasn't supposed to be real." "I know," he said, stepping closer. "But it became real for me. And I think it did for you too." Her silence was answer enough. She turned back to him, her eyes glistening. "I don't know if I can trust this," she said softly. "You've spent your whole life controlling everything. How do I know this isn't just another way to keep control?" His chest tightened at her words. She was right. Trust didn't come easily, especially not with someone like him. But he was willing to try. "Because for the first time in my life, I'm not trying to control anything. I just want to be with you." Emma's eyes searched his, and for a moment, the walls she had built around herself seemed to waver. She exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing. "I need time, Adrian," she said finally. "I can't just jump into this." He nodded, relief washing over him. "Take all the time you need. I'll wait." And for the first time in years, Adrian Blackwell let go of control, placing his fate in the hands of someone else. The gala continued late into the evening, the guests reveling in the opulence and grandeur Adrian had orchestrated. Emma returned to the ballroom, blending into the crowd with practiced ease. She exchanged polite words with investors, executives, and their spouses, her movements graceful but detached. She was aware of Adrian's gaze following her, even as he stood at a distance, surrounded by people who sought his attention. For Emma, the night felt like a performance she could no longer sustain. The weight of the past months pressed heavily on her. She had entered into this arrangement believing she could separate her role from her reality, but Adrian's words on the balcony had complicated everything. He had exposed a vulnerability she wasn't ready to confront, both in him and in herself. Later that night, as the guests began to leave, Emma retreated to their shared suite. It was a space that, despite its luxury, felt more like a gilded cage than a home. She removed her jewelry and unpinned her hair, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She hardly recognized the woman looking back at her. The designer gown, the polished demeanor, it was all a facade, one she had mastered but never truly owned. The sound of the door opening pulled her from her thoughts. Adrian entered, his tie loosened and his expression unreadable. He crossed the room silently, pouring himself a drink from the bar cart in the corner. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension between them palpable. Finally, Emma broke the silence. "You didn't have to say those things tonight." Adrian turned to face her, his glass in hand. "What things?" "About wanting this to be real," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "About wanting me." "I didn't say them because I had to," Adrian replied, his tone calm but firm. "I said them because they're true." Emma shook her head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "This was never supposed to be about feelings, Adrian. It was supposed to be a business deal. Nothing more." "Do you really believe that?" he asked, taking a step closer. "Do you really think this is just a transaction for me?" She met his gaze, her own emotions warring within her. "It doesn't matter what I believe. What matters is that we had an agreement, and I don't want to complicate it." Adrian set his glass down, his expression softening. "Emma, you're not just a part of this arrangement to me. You're everything I didn't know I needed. You've changed the way I see the world. The way I see myself." His words cut through her defenses, but Emma refused to let them take hold. "You can't just decide that now," she said, her voice trembling. "You can't undo everything we agreed on because you've had some kind of epiphany." Adrian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know this isn't what you signed up for. But I can't pretend anymore. I can't go back to the way things were." Emma turned away, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She had spent so much of her life protecting herself, shielding her heart from disappointment and pain. Letting Adrian in felt like a risk she wasn't sure she could take. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to think about what I want." Adrian nodded, though his heart sank at her words. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. "I'll be here." The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension. Emma spent more time away from the penthouse, visiting Lucy and immersing herself in the familiar simplicity of her old life. She found solace in the warmth of her sister's laughter, the cluttered chaos of their small apartment. But no matter how far she tried to distance herself, her thoughts always returned to Adrian. She hated the way he had gotten under her skin, the way his vulnerability had shifted the dynamic between them. He wasn't the cold, calculating man she had once thought him to be. He was flawed, yes, but also human. And that realization terrified her. Adrian, meanwhile, threw himself into his work, but his usual drive felt hollow. Every deal, every meeting, every triumph seemed meaningless without Emma by his side. He hadn't just lost control of the arrangement, he had lost control of himself. One evening, as he sat alone in the penthouse, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Emma. "We need to talk. Can I come by tomorrow?" His chest tightened as he read the words. It wasn't the resolution he had hoped for, but it was something. And for Adrian, it was enough to keep hope alive. The following evening, Adrian paced the living room of his penthouse, his usually calm demeanor replaced with restless energy. Emma's message had occupied his thoughts since the moment he received it. He replayed the words over and over, trying to decipher her tone, her intent. Did she want to end things for good? Or was there a chance, however small, that she was reconsidering? When the elevator doors opened and Emma stepped into the room, Adrian froze. She looked as composed as ever, but there was a tension in her shoulders, a guardedness in her expression that gave her away. She carried herself with the quiet dignity he had always admired, even in moments like this. "Emma," he said softly, his voice carrying both relief and apprehension. She nodded in acknowledgement, stepping further into the room. "Thank you for letting me come." "You don't have to thank me," Adrian said, gesturing for her to sit. "You're always welcome here." She hesitated before taking a seat on the sofa, folding her hands in her lap. Adrian sat across from her, the glass coffee table between them feeling like a chasm. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Finally, Emma broke it. "I've been thinking a lot about Everything, she began, her voice measured. About this arrangement, about you, about me. Adrian leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on her. And? Emma exhaled slowly, gathering her thoughts. When we started this, I told myself I could keep it separate, that it was just a job, a means to an end. But somewhere along the way, it became more complicated. Adrian nodded, sensing the weight behind her words. It became real. Yes, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. And that scares me. Her honesty disarmed him, and for a moment, Adrian didn't know what to say. He had spent his life mastering control, wielding power with precision, but Emma was the one thing he couldn't control. She was unpredictable, unyielding, and it terrified him as much as it fascinated him. I know I'm not the kind of man who makes things easy, he said finally. I know I've made mistakes, more than I care to admit. But, Emma, I can't ignore what this has become. I can't ignore what you've come to mean to me. Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of vulnerability and resolve. Adrian, I didn't come here for a confession. Then why did you come? He asked, his voice tinged with desperation. She hesitated, then said, I came because I needed to tell you that I can't do this if it's not real. I can't be part of a life that's built on appearances and power plays. I need honesty. I need trust. And I need to know that this isn't just another way for you to control things. Adrian swallowed hard, her words cutting through him like a blade. I can't promise you perfection, Emma, but I can promise you this. I want to be better. For us. Emma's gaze softened, and for the first time, the walls she had built around herself seemed to waver. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his words were more than just empty promises. But trust wasn't something she gave easily. Actions speak louder than words, Adrian, she said quietly. If you want me to believe you, you'll have to show me. I will, Adrian said, his voice steady with conviction. Whatever it takes, I'll show you. For the first time in what felt like forever, hope flickered between them. A fragile, tentative thing that neither of them dared to fully embrace. But it was there, a glimmer of possibility that things could be different. The nights stretched on as they talked, their words gradually peeling back the layers of distance that had kept them apart. Adrian spoke of his past, of the wounds that had shaped him into the man he was. Emma listened, her empathy bridging the gap between their worlds. And for the first time, Adrian felt truly seen, not as a powerful CO, but as a man trying to find his way. When Emma finally rose to leave, Adrian walked her to the elevator. They stood in silence as the doors opened, the air between them heavy with unspoken possibilities. Good night, Adrian, Emma said softly, stepping into the elevator. Good night, Emma, he replied, his voice filled with a quiet determination. As the doors closed, Adrian stood there, his heart pounding. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. Because for Emma, for what they could become, he was willing to fight. Adrian stood motionless as the elevator doors closed, his reflection faintly visible in their polished surface. The quiet hum of the elevator receding into the distance left him with the kind of silence that demanded introspection. For years, his world had revolved around control, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of success. Now, for the first time, he felt uncertain, and oddly, it didn't unsettle him as much as it should have. The next morning, Adrian threw himself into work with a vigor that surprised even his team. Meetings were scheduled back-to-back, deals were negotiated with precision, and yet, his thoughts drifted constantly to Emma. Her voice lingered in his mind, her words echoing with a clarity that refused to fade. Actions speak louder than words. Those words haunted him. Adrian had built an empire through strategy and power, but Emma's challenge required something more, a vulnerability he wasn't sure he possessed. Still, he was determined to prove her wrong, to show her that he was capable of change. Meanwhile, Emma returned to her apartment in Brooklyn, greeted by Lucy's cheerful voice as she worked on an art project at the kitchen table. The cluttered space, filled with mismatched furniture and the comforting scent of homemade soup, grounded Emma in a way Adrian's penthouse never could. Yet, even here, her mind couldn't escape him. Is something wrong? Lucy asked, glancing up from her sketchbook. You've been quiet all morning. Emma forced a smile. Just a lot on my mind. Lucy tilted her head, studying her sister. Does it have to do with him? Emma hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. Lucy set her pencil down and crossed her arms. I know you think this whole thing is complicated, but it's not, Emma. Either he's worth your time, or he's not. You deserve someone who respects you, someone who sees how amazing you are. Emma blinked, taken aback by Lucy's words. It's not that simple. Why not? Lucy asked. If he's serious about you, he'll prove it. And if he doesn't, then you walk away. Emma looked away, her thoughts racing. Lucy's advice was straightforward, but the reality was far messier. Adrian had shown glimpses of vulnerability, moments that hinted at something deeper, but was it enough? Could she trust him to follow through on his promises? That weekend, Adrian surprised his team by canceling his usual meetings and insisting on a visit to one of his company's community projects, a housing development for low-income families. It was a project he had approved years ago but rarely visited, delegating the details to his executives. Today, he wanted to see it for himself. When he arrived, the sight of the modest buildings, surrounded by children playing and families chatting, struck him in a way he hadn't expected. As he toured the site, he listened to stories of residents who had been given a fresh start thanks to the development. Their gratitude was genuine, their struggles a stark contrast to the world of wealth and privilege he usually inhabited. One resident, an elderly woman with kind eyes, pulled him aside. "You don't realize how much you've done for us," she said, her voice trembling. "You've given people hope." Adrian nodded, his throat tight. For so long, he had measured success in profits and power, but this was something different, something meaningful. He left the site with a newfound resolve to focus on projects that made a real difference. Emma's eyes softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. "I believe you, Adrian. But trust takes time. And I need to know that this isn't just a phase." "It's not," he said firmly. "I'm in this for the long haul. For us." The cafe bustled around them, but in that moment, it felt as though they were the only two people in the world. Emma reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "Then let's see where this goes." Adrian's heart swelled at her words, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly at peace. The days that followed marked the beginning of something new, something neither Adrian nor Emma had fully anticipated. Their interactions were no longer bound by the constraints of their former arrangement. There was a quiet authenticity between them now, a mutual understanding that allowed them to explore what they could become without pretense or performance. Adrian continued his efforts to reshape his life, not just for Emma but for himself. He found purpose in his work with the communities his development served, spending more time with people whose lives were impacted by his decisions. He discovered that the satisfaction he had once sought through power and control paled in comparison to the fulfillment of making a real difference. Emma, meanwhile, found herself letting go of the skepticism that had shielded her for so long. She began to trust Adrian, not because of his words but because of his actions. He wasn't the man she had first met, calculating, detached, and self-absorbed. He was becoming someone who cared, someone who listened, and someone who valued the connections he once dismissed. One evening, as they walked through the park where they had met weeks earlier, Adrian stopped and turned to face her. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the city, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. "Emma," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I've spent my whole life chasing things that didn't matter. But when I'm with you, everything feels different. You make me want to be better, not because I have to, but because I want to." Emma looked up at him, her heart swelling at his words. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability he had once hidden so carefully. "Adrian, I've seen the way you've changed. And I believe in you. But this isn't about perfection. It's about being honest with each other, even when it's hard." "I know," he said, taking her hands in his. "And I want to build something real with you, something that isn't about deals or arrangements. Just us." Emma smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "Then let's take it one step at a time. Together." Adrian nodded, his own smile breaking through the seriousness of his expression. Together. As they continued their walk, The city lights began to twinkle in the distance, a reminder of the world they had left behind and the one they were building together. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't always be easy, but for the first time, they both felt ready to face whatever came next. Because for Adrian and Emma, this was more than a story about a CEO and a housekeeper. It was a story about transformation, about breaking free from the roles they had been forced to play, and about discovering the strength that came from letting someone in. And as they walked hand in hand through the city, they knew they had finally found something real. Something worth fighting for. Something worth keeping.